before we start now. Welcome, I'm Catherine Whalen, Associate Professor here at the Bard Graduate Center, and I'm co-convener of this series, the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Horowitz Seminar on New York and American Material Culture, which I co-convene with my colleagues David Jaffe and Henry. And I'm beyond pleased to introduce Namita Gupta Wiggers, tonight's speaker. Her talk is entitled, Making Space, Museums and Craft in the 21st Century. Namita is a writer, curator, and educator based in Portland, Oregon. She's also been a metalsmith and ethnographer. She is the director and co-founder of the Critical Craft Forum, an online, on-site platform that, for exchange, that offers real-time conversations about issues in the field. This is on Facebook, and I strongly encourage everyone who's interested, and even if you're not sure you're interested, to take a look and join. And I think the link actually is in our announcement that went out. Namita now teaches in the MFA Applied Craft and Design program, which is co-administered by the Oregon College of Art and Craft and the Pacific Northwest College of Art. For 10 years, from 2004 to 2014, she served as director and chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in Portland, Oregon, and she'll be showing us some of the many exhibitions that she did there in her talk today. She contributes to online and in-print journals and books, and is currently the exhibition review editor for the Journal of Modern Craft. Her current projects include, and this is a list, Across the Table, Across the Land with Michael Strand for the National Council on Ceramic Education of the Arts, a textile-focused exhibition at the Wing Luke Museum of Asian Pacific American Experience in Seattle, a makerspace project at the Patricia and Philip Frost Museum of Science in Miami, and the forthcoming publication, Companion to Contemporary Craft with Wally Blackwell. On a more personal note, I first met Namita at the 2009 American Craft Council conference called Creating a New Craft Culture. And that title encapsulates what Namita does for the field of craft history as well as contemporary practice. She's more than just a breath of fresh air. She's a gale force wind. And I mean that in the best possible sense. Working with her is like having a shot of adrenaline and or really good espresso. Of the many things she excels at, I'll highlight one in particular, her unparalleled ability and commitment to making space for inclusive dialogue among makers, academics, curators, collectors, students, and anyone with an interest in the conversations she warmly and expertly fosters. In her talk this evening, she'll tell us more about how she makes that space in the fullest possible sense. Please join me in welcoming Namita Wiggers.
Thank you for that really lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to both Catherine and David for the invitation to come to speak at Bard, and to Mr. and Mrs. Horowitz for generously making these opportunities available for people to come all the way from Portland and be really happy that it's not last weekend because it took me 19 hours to get home from Asheville, North Carolina, and I was very grateful for the beautiful weather. So it's always lovely to have people who understand that students need to have connections with lots of different kinds of folks from many places, and that's really wonderful to have that here at Bard. This is my first time speaking at Bard, and also my first time speaking in New York. So out of curiosity, before I begin, I'm wondering if I could see from a show of hands if anybody has been to Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, Oregon. Oh, wow. Okay, 2 or 3 of you I know, so. There's about 5 or 6 people. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. You never know, coming from so far away, if there are folks. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to start out by just giving sort of an overview of the museums that are in this conversation about contemporary craft, and then move into some examples about how I make space through exhibition practices. And part of what I'm doing today is leading to a series of workshops that I've been invited to do by Dr. Damien Skinner, and the Auckland Museum later on in July. And I will be thinking about, I'm in the process of thinking through how to better articulate my process, my methodologies, kind of come to some way to describe how I put together exhibitions. To be quite honest, when you are the only curator with one other staff person from 2008 to 2012, you do a lot of exhibitions, but you don't get a whole lot of time to step back and think. So one of the big pleasures I've had in the last year and a half is to be able to step back and think a little bit about what I'm doing. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm hoping that your engagement at the end will help me think some of these things through for myself as well. So to start out, these are some of the institutions in the United States that are focused on craft. And I say some because there are a number of university and college art galleries and museums that I did not include here, like the Curator, for example. There's also, I didn't include Ulysses Dietz's work at the Newark Art Museum. So there are a couple of others, but this list here gives you some of the institutions that specifically focus on craft or craft-based media. So it gives you a sense of how it breaks out geographically. I love Google. I love being able to use this kind of technology quickly. With that, step back in time just a bit to 1897, and many of the arts organizations and craft organizations were founded in relationship to the arts and crafts movement. And this is 1897, so we've got the beginning here with the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston. But then in the 30s and 40s and 50s, things start to change. So in the 1930s, there are 3 institutions that opened up, including the institution for which I worked for 10 years. That's originally founded as the Oregon Ceramic Studio, and it opened in 1937, and it was not an arts and crafts organization. It was actually founded based on Lydia Herrick Hodges' visits to Europe. And so she was very interested in the artist ateliers that she saw and decided that it would be a really great way to bring contemporary ceramics into Portland, Oregon. In the 1950s, Museum of Arts and Design opened. In 1960s, a couple opened, and I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to anyone that the 1970s was this blossoming of organizations around the country that were focused on contemporary craft. What I thought was really interesting is how it's very much the East Coast and the West Coast. So it's a very interesting divide there and split. Now, the 80s and 90s were not so good for opening craft institutions in terms of birthing new ones. It was a great time period for children's museums and science museums, but not really for craft museums. However, moving into the 2000s, this isn't so far off from what was going on in the 1970s. These are all institutions that opened or recommitted their missions to focus on contemporary craft in the United States in the 2000s. Plus 2 institutions who dropped their name, have dropped craft from their name. And I think we all know it's the American Craft Museum became Museum of Arts and Design, and California College for the Arts became California College for the Arts and Crafts became California College for the Arts, and then did do a conference on craft in 2010. So craft didn't leave, it just got taken out of the name. But again, this gives you an interesting shift, whereas before, in the 70s, it was almost an even East Coast, West Coast thing. In 2000s, it's all pretty heavily West Coast. And I mention that because I think it's really important to remember that craft is not happening in the same way that the art world is really centered in New York. Craft happens all over the country, and right now, craft museums in the West Coast really are the places that a lot of change is happening, so keep that in mind. So the institution that I worked for, I began there first as a jeweler in 1999. I was selling my work in the gallery store. And then in 2004 became the first curator to focus on the exhibitions and collections. I never had any intention to be a curator. I was never trained as a curator. I was trained as a museum educator, and I worked on graduate work in art history. But being a curator seemed to be this wonderful opportunity that I couldn't pass up because they were building a new kind of museum. So they began as a ceramic center, and it was a very unusual situation in that there was a kiln And they brought people like Marguerite Wildenhain and Bernard Leach. Peter Voulkos had a big role in the 1950s. So it was very much the place to go to see contemporary ceramics during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. In the 64, it became Contemporary Crafts Gallery, and it was renamed that to really sort of signal the breadth that it wasn't just ceramics. They were working in, bringing in work by artists who were working in all kinds of media. Renamed Contemporary Crafts Museum and Gallery in 2002, and I won't go through the list because it did seem like there was a little period where it was a new year, new logo, new name. So this is sort of the shorthand version of it. Museum of Contemporary Craft opened in 2007 in the Pearl District in Portland. And in 2008, we went through financial struggles just like the rest of the world. And in 2009, began a partnership with Pacific Northwest College of Art. And now Pacific Northwest College of Art is located just down the street from the museum. So this area of the park blocks in Portland is now starting to develop into a really lovely arts campus. So it's a pretty spectacular situation. So, making space. The reason I titled this Making Space is because I think that is what I do when I make an exhibition. But in addition to that, I think it's really important to think about making space as a very deliberate move to open up the arena for new ways of thinking and new ways of working. Making space is not about filling a quota. It's not about following an agenda. Making space is about restructuring systems so that new ways can emerge for doing work and new ways of making museums. And that's really what has guided me over the 10 years plus that I've been working on exhibitions. It's really trying to figure out, knowing what I know about museums, how museums work, and trying to clear room for other ways of approaching museums that come through craft rather than the contemporary art and theory as the primary lens that I've been trained as to follow. So with that, I had a beautiful advantage of being able to actually participate in the development of the space that I worked in. Now, I know that those of you who are going to go on to curatorial work are not going to necessarily get to shape a whole new museum. It's a really rare experience. But I think that there are things that I learned in shaping this space that I personally think could be brought into critical practices and exhibition practices that relate to craft. Specifically, thinking about the fact that craft-based objects, for the most part, are three-dimensional. And the space that we designed was really designed as if it's a giant vitrine. So you're curating on the bottom, you've got multiple points of entry, you've got 2 rows of windows, but you also have a way of looking down into the space. So it becomes this opportunity to understand an object in its dimensional form rather than simply against a wall. We also designed the walls ourselves. These are our portable walls, and they fit into the storage. So it really was an opportunity to engage craftspeople in our community. The person who built these is a glassblower named Eric Franklin, and he was our exhibition prep for a number of years, our exhibition designer too. And so it really is about applying your knowledge to work around some of these problems of space and portability and so forth. Doesn't solve the problem that we don't have a freight elevator, but you can move these walls very, very easily and secure them quite well. The other thing we did is we really did not want to have plinths. I can't tell you how many photographs I've looked at where what you see is a sea of plinths. You barely see the objects. And this aesthetic, which this aesthetic has unfortunately really come to represent a certain kind of exhibition practice that we definitely didn't want to do. So that was one priority, and with that we decided that we wanted to address the plinth as a piece of furniture. So we designed our pedestal system to be flat packed, so everything comes apart, flat packs, and all of the pieces that go together in the pedestal system, the furniture system, can be stored in a very compact area. So the only troubling part is really the bonnets or vitrines and the very, very large platforms. So it was a way of applying craft and design to think through the problem of space issues for a small museum, but to also embrace the fact that objects are being shown on furniture as opposed to on these giant, white, monolithic, uninviting cubes. So what we were really trying to do was to develop something where the white cube met craft, but something that didn't leave craft behind, and didn't leave behind this beautiful space we had when we were on Southwest Corbett. So we wanted a lot of natural light. All of the windows have UV shades, so we can shut them whenever there's a textile exhibition up. There's a wonderful way of bringing in large-scale installation work as well as small work. So it really is a space that allows for craft to not just be the tiny object, but allows for craft to be monumental and gigantic as well, and to consume space rather than to just be relegated to the plinth. And this was very deliberate on our part to make sure that we had spaces like this, and especially to put the really tall one downstairs because we didn't have a freight elevator. So it worked out very well. And these are a couple of the exhibitions that gives you a sense of how flexible this space actually is for shifting gears depending on what's being shown. So here's the question that I would like to throw out to everyone to think about. One of the big issues is this idea that craft is the underdog. Craft wants to be art. Craft museums want to be art museums. And I can't help but wonder if maybe we are already there. We just haven't figured out how to articulate it or be okay with it. We've got craft made by hand. All kinds of things are being talked about as being made by hand. You've got Domino's talking about their crafted pizzas. There's crafted objects in these beautiful stores that sell all the indigo dyed clothing and leather goods that you could possibly want. Craft in the form of Ken Price is located in Miami at Basel. Craft is everywhere. So I can't help but wonder if we kind of have reached that point and we need to stop feeling a bit like underdogs and start actually stepping back and articulating what it is that we do and what we do well and where we are actually bringing a different perspective or voice into the broader visual arts field. So one of the things that's going on right now that I find absolutely fascinating and is really an interest in materiality. You see this in design classes, you see this in sculpture classes, see it in craft-based classes, but the thing that's happening is basically that in the programs where craft-based media are being disbanded, ceramics programs, textile programs, etc., they're being subsumed into sculpture, but it's really around this notion of materiality instead of around this very specific pursuit of that particular medium. And what's interesting is in the last 15 years, I have seen a huge, huge surge of interest in Richard Serra's verb list. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is a project, actually a future project that I'm working on, is that this verb list actually is extremely similar to a list from Forms in Japan that came out in 1963. Whole sections of it are verbatim from Forms in Japan. So one of my future projects is to explore how craft is actually the foundation of conceptual art. I'll leave you with that. The other debate that has raged over the last 10 years is the skill, de-skilling, and reskilling debate. And at one point, a number of us were talking about doing a sloppy craft exhibition. And I have to be honest that we talked and talked. We had a panel with Ann Wilson and Josh Fott and a number of other people. And we realized together that it just really wasn't going to make sense to pull it together as an exhibition. And I'm so glad that we didn't actually do it. There's a wonderful book that has come out that talks about sloppy craft. But we actually are starting to see this aesthetic in so many different ways. A friend of mine shared some of her students' work, and her student had visibly grown up, come into her schooling, come out of her schooling, looking at work like this. So this has already, it's become a very strong particular kind of thread in the craft movement and the art movement in the world. And I think an exhibition would have probably codified it too soon and not let it sort of become something that permeated and it gets morphed and becomes a nice line in the sand for people to sink their teeth into. So the other thing is that in non-craft museums, we're seeing craft-based work all the time. And Jenny Sorkin has a fantastic essay that she just published in the Smithsonian nation building publication that just came out on the term craft-like. And it was something that she had explored on a panel we organized with Critical Craft Forum at College Art Association. And you could argue that some of the work that has surfaced in art museums is craft-like and less craft, but you can't argue that the Frimkisses are very, very great examples of the studio craft movement. And the fact that they, when they were exhibited at the Hammer, won the popular award for their work at that time gives an indication of a real shift and a real interest in the studio craft work that we weren't seeing in 2004 or 5, 6, 7 even. And speaking of sloppy craft, this is one of the exhibitions that the craft world and the art world love to go head to head over, which is the Dirt on Delight exhibition that was at the ICA. This is a great example of the kinds of exhibitions that are happening now where people are mixing things up. The silos aren't there in the same way that they were even 5 years ago and 10 years ago. So it becomes this opportunity to use any museum, not just a craft museum, not just a contemporary art museum, but any museum space to rethink these relationships between the decorative arts and contemporary art. We're seeing a lot of artists whose work is clearly visibly influenced by craft histories. Now, Bill O'Brien does not necessarily articulate that in his statements, and he doesn't necessarily talk about the influence of the ceramics world, but when you're standing in front of that row of objects, you can see the covers of Craft Horizons and American Craft Magazine and Ceramics Monthly coming through in those objects. The influences are there. They've become subsumed into the broader art conversation. We also have had the DIY movement grow up. So it started out as this great punk riot girl kind of a movement. It was very much about working with materials that were right at hand. This year marks the 10th anniversary of Handmade Nation. And I'm really proud that Faith Levine gifted the archives for Handmade Nation to the Museum of Contemporary Craft. So if anybody is interested in studying that, we are the site to go to. But the DIY movement has shifted, and a number of the people who are pictured here are now finding themselves in curatorial positions, chairing academic departments. It's a great example of how this decade really shifted from this immediacy of a certain kind of making into sort of developing a lot of tangents, and a lot of use of the internet is a really important thing with this particular group. What you're also getting are makers, and the makers movement is another one that is bringing a really interesting connection between the factory and making. And this is Mud Shark Studios in Portland, where they do projects, small run ceramics projects for designers, but they also make the growlers. They're based on whiskey jugs, and these growlers are hugely popular in Portland for your craft beer. But the return to the factory is kind of the newest thing that I'm seeing in a number of places. The Brahms Mount Blanket Factory is a great example, and Bullseye Glass in Portland has been in place for decades. So the factory is becoming a really interesting source of interest for people. It's making in a different format, and I think craftspeople are connecting with it in a different sort of way, and that's something we're going to see more of in the next decade. So the craft museums it's not just the art museums that are breaking the boundaries, the craft museums are breaking the boundaries and showing work by people who have been considered capital A artists or blue chip artists as well. And this exhibition was originated at Arcadia University. Museum of Contemporary Craft was the first to show it, Ai Weiwei's work in a solo museum exhibition on the West Coast. So this boundary breaking is happening all over. So that gives you a bit of a context for the last decade or so in terms of the kinds of things that I've been looking at, thinking about, and programming with or in opposition to. So the history of craft. The history of craft is a complicated history, and it's a local history, it's a regional history. It connects to the national, but the local stories are the ones that have to be written still. They need to be documented, they need to be cared for and stewarded in a way that we almost have jumped right to the national and not taken care of the local. It was very important to me to do that. It also is important to me to make space. And the exhibition that opened the Museum of Contemporary Craft was Craft in America, Expanding Traditions. And we decided to take this exhibition as a great sort of touchstone moment so that it could be a blockbuster type exhibition. They really wanted it, I think, in many ways to be like Objects USA. It wasn't, but it was a good exhibition, and it gave us an opportunity to give this survey of the studio craft movement to Portland's audiences before we started breaking down the category of craft through multiple different ways of thinking about it. The thing that struck me, though, is when I got the checklist and we went out also to Arkansas to look at the objects, I thought, well, whose America is this that we're looking at, and which traditions are actually being engaged here? So in the installation, I used the opportunity as the curator to put my own twist on it a little bit. So the first piece you see when you walk in is a George Nakashima bench. And some of you know that George Nakashima learned a number of woodworking skills when he was incarcerated in the internment camps during World War II. You also, on the right-hand side, had David Clemens' Chitlin servers, Wendy Moriyama's Mickey Mouse, Macintosh, her Mickey Macintosh chair. On the other side, there were pieces that were by Dale Chihuly mixed in with Native American cylinder baskets. And then way in the back, just as you walked in the back, you can see that textile there. That actually is Jack Leonard Larson's work, and it's based on Indian shisha embroidery. Very subtle. Most people didn't see it. There wasn't that I was trying to say, this is diversity in America, I'm going to restructure it, but it was a way that I was able to sort of turn things just a little bit to tweak it and make space. And the reason that I wanted to make the space is because this is the beautiful group of people who are curating craft right now, some of them, a lot of them. It's a great group of people. They are brilliant, they work really hard. There are 4 people who are not of European origin on this list. And now there's one problem. We have a problem, particularly in America, was it very too subtle, and perhaps that we're bringing in fresher, newer voices as we move forward. I also feel that I bring craft into my work by paying attention to how I tell the story as much as what I'm showing. How is as important as what. It means bringing the hand into the making process. Being willing to commit 40 hours of your prep's time to hand paint the Ai Weiwei signage, because it's really cheeky to hand paint Ai Weiwei signage next to all of his ceramics work. And is anyone going to really notice? Some people notice. It has a different feel to it, but it lets it bring in this other element, this subtle element of the hand in there. The other picture is Shannon Stratton and Judy Lehman decided to hand color in all of the signage for Gestures of Resistance. It took hours, hours and hours. They had the hand cramps, but every piece of signage in the museum, major piece of signage, had hand colored in graphite text, and it just popped. So it's a small, subtle thing, but it's a little thing that lets us say, when you walk into a craft museum, all the details are being paid attention to. Everything, including the paper that the label is on, including the way the letters are being presented. So it's taking that craft ideal to the nth degree. It's also trying to find new ways to tell the story. So I tell this story a lot, and some of you may have heard me tell this story, but a lot of people would come up to me and say, oh, I know how you become a crafts person. you apprentice with the potter down the street, and that's how you learn how to be a potter. Well, that hasn't been the case for a very long time. You go now to get a BFA degree, you get an MFA degree. You follow a very particular trajectory of learning, but it's a trajectory that's really rooted in academic relationships in a different sort of way. And that's not to say that apprenticeships don't happen, but the primary way for people to follow this pursuit of craft-based work is through this particular academic model. So what you see here is my taking giant, crazy Post-it notes with all kinds of scribbles on them saying, Peter Vokas worked with this person, and he studied with Francis Senska, and then he worked with this person, and this person worked with that person. And then I tried to write it out as a story, and it became very biblical, because Patty Warashina was a student of Robert Sperry's, and she was married to Fred Bauer. Then she divorced Fred Bauer, and she married Robert Sperry. So how do you put that in an exhibition and show all those relationships without, like, the words just take away from the story? So I thought about Edward Tufte, and I thought about subway maps and visual displays of information. So I took these crazy Post-it maps to John Arndt and Wan Hee-jiang, who studied at Eindhoven and they teach at University of Oregon, and I said, here, I need help. I need you to make sense of all of these notes. And John has a BFA in ceramics from Alfred University and created this map for the exhibition, which also became the map for how the exhibition was laid out. And the relationships were signified by a solid or a double line using auto decal tape, which does not come off concrete floors very well. Don't use it. They use it on cars so it will stay, and it stays really, really well. We used double lines to show teacher-student relationships, and we showed used single lines to show collegial relationships. But here's the thing, I wanted to know who was coming to the museum that summer. I wanted to understand, but I didn't want to do a lot of surveys. I didn't want to do, like, fill out the slip at the front door kind of a thing, because we were working with volunteers at the front door. And it's not always comfortable for a volunteer to be the person who's asking you, can you fill this out, right? So we made the same map in chalk in the lab, which is our program space, and invited people to sign their names next to somebody that they had worked with. And the most fascinating thing came out of it. We realized that our visitors were primarily West Coast oriented. The folks like Wayne Higby, who teaches at Alfred, I can't think of all the names now, but a couple of the other folks who are in Warren Mackenzie, for example, only a couple of names. Around Peter Vokas, around the folks who had, Paul Sodner, the people who were on the West Coast, lots and lots of names. So it was a really interesting way to take a snapshot. Is it scientific? No. Is it anecdotal and productive to understand a little bit of who's coming in? Absolutely. Did it show how we connect the ceramics to the audiences who are coming in? Absolutely. So it gave me a different kind of data to work with. And it was a lot less biblical than, who begat who. The other thing that's wonderful about a small museum is that you can zone in on just one small question. My exhibitions tend to be about questions. I don't make exhibitions to give the definitive final answer on anything. I think of exhibitions as opening up a space for questions, for you to bring your questions, for me to ask questions, for new questions to come out. It's not a space to be the end-all, be-all statement of anything. And one of the things that I was interested in is when I came to the museum, there was a David Shaner piece. David Shaner ran the Archie Bray Foundation in Montana for a long time, and it was this piece that's, all of these pieces are human scale. They're literally like the length of his arms. Well, this particular piece in the collection was really hard for me to understand, which means that that's the kind of work that you spend all your time trying to figure out and understand. It was not particularly attractive. It looked like the clay had barely been worked. There was glaze in the middle, so you couldn't really use it for anything, and it kind of looked a bit like a cake platter in that it had a round thing at the bottom, and it was chunky and heavy, so when you put it down, you would leave it where it was. I didn't understand it. Robert Smithson's spiral jetty started to be under attack at one point, and I started looking at it and I realized what David Shaner is doing is land art. It's a response to the landscape, but it's coming through ceramics instead. So it gave me the opportunity to flip things and to ask, what if land art isn't just about monumental scraping of the earth and digging in the earth and these big giant machinery? What if land art is a zeitgeist? It's a way of thinking about the personal relationship with the landscape that sometimes takes this monumental scale and sometimes takes a very personal human scale. So it gave a chance to really explore that. Lori Herrick Weaving Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow is probably one of my favorite exhibitions. I have several. I did 67 exhibitions at the museum. So Lori Herrick, the reason Lori Herrick is so interesting to me is because we were able to tell the story that is a typical story of so many weavers across the United States. We have some 90 weaving guilds in the state of Oregon. The average age is probably 75. But there are 90 weaving guilds, and the ladies in there know their stuff. They know what they're doing. Lori Herrick is someone they all admired greatly. She taught for a number of years at Oregon College of Art and Craft. She's the person who purchased all the Macomber looms, and this is one of them, for the college. She brought people in to teach that were the top weavers in the world at that particular time. So she was connecting the local with the global. She also is a great example of someone who was working specifically on the loom. And I guarantee you could go to Minneapolis, you could go to Denver, you could go to Boise, Idaho, you could go to Chicago, and you will find a weaver who was a lot like Lori, really, really good at working on the loom and working with a very particular history of weaving. Sometimes loom-controlled garments might have even been a part of it. But this is the kind of story that is so challenging to tell because there isn't a book for me to go to. There wasn't an article for me to go to. There was nothing for me to give Lauren Rayburn, who's here tonight, who is our curatorial assistant for this project, nothing to say, Lauren, go read these articles. I could send her to read Annie Alber's books, I could send her to read weaving books, all kinds of guild documents, things like that, but there isn't a primary source. So with Lauren's help, we went through all of Lori's records, and thankfully weavers are almost as anal, if not more so, than metalsmiths, and they keep track of everything. So Lori had the most meticulous files, and it made it very easy for us to determine 7 types of weavings that she did that were going to be the focus for the exhibition, but also be the kind of pieces that we would then use to give people the chance to weave these objects for themselves, to work with them on their own. So what you see here are John and Ann Sinclair. Ann is Lori's niece, and they are counting the stitches, counting the threads on the loom, on the weaving, so that they can then, with the help of Kristen Pisola, who is another intern for this project, they can take that draft and the actual object and turn it into a digitized draft. Those drafts are now available online in this format, and you can download them, you can manipulate them, you can do whatever you want with them. And all we ask is that you take whatever you made and send it back to the museum, and it gets posted on a Flickr site. So it becomes a compendium of how people are engaging Lori's weavings. What it also does is it allows for Lori's weavings that are signature weavings of the 50s, 60s, and 70s to become activated through making and through sharing of information. And we brought in 5 artist residents, each of whom had a specific kind of skill. One was a guild weaver who'd studied with Lori. Another was Christy Matson, who works with sound, and she did an op art weaving in a record based on one of Lori's pieces. We gave the artists in residence the exact same information that you can download off of the website. Because when you put a piece of paper in an artist's hands, you're going to get something pretty spectacular and different. So it gives an opportunity for the artists to share their voice at the level of the workmanship that they're going to do, but it also gives the chance for the general public to engage this as well. Betty Fivas was an exhibition that we used to focus on community. And this exhibition came together. Betty Fivas was a student of Alexander Archipenko and Clifford Still. She was a potter who lived in Pendleton for almost all of her life, with a few exceptional years where she was in New York and worked for Design Techniques. Betty Fivas, this exhibition was all about community. And what we did with this was go out to Pendleton to be in her home, working with her objects and actually trying to represent the work in the way that she lived. She was somebody who basically the fireman would have to be called when she would do a pottery, raccoon firing in her front yard, because they would come and they'd be like, Mrs. Fivas, is there a fire at your house again? So she was always right out there in the middle of it. So we wanted our photographs. This gave us the chance to even get photography that tied in with the way she was working and living, so that when we represented it in the museum, we could do our best to try to bring that same sort of casual energy that was in her home into the museum. We could also bring her great nephew in. He's a photographer, and we brought his photographs of the Pendleton landscape that she lived in for all but 5 years of her life into the museum as well. It was also an opportunity for me to really understand the difference between doing research for craftspeople who have never been documented before, and doing research on an artist who has had tons and tons of material written about them. Everybody kept saying that she could just find clay. And I thought, did she have a divining rod? I mean, how did she go out and find this clay, right? So as I'm going through this box that they explained was the box that stayed on her bench, what we found were maps that were geological survey maps for the states of Oregon and Washington. And in the process, I uncovered this ring of small test tiles. She was systematically going to places that had deposits that had the minerals she wanted in order to dig up the clay she needed to make her work. So you have to be able to understand how ceramics works. You have to be able to know that's a test tile. You have to be able to understand what to look for to give you clues that are going to give you a sense of how and why the local clay was an aesthetic of hers. It became an aesthetic because at first she couldn't get regular clay, any other clay in Oregon, and even now, most of the clay is not from that part of the country. A lot of it comes from back east. But you needed to know what to look for. There's a different texture to research, and it just needs to happen in completely different ways than what we were trained to do as art historians. Her family liked this area because it was the messiest and it felt the most like her. Oh, and by the way, I should tell you that the beauty of being in a small museum means that you also learn some really great shortcuts. Those gorgeous black and white photographs, $10 each at Oregon Blueprint. They don't look like they're $10, but you can do these things sometimes on the slide. Another thing I experimented with was the collection, and we have had a very quirky collection. It has a lot of really great pieces early in artists' careers. It has a lot of ceramics, and it's, I doubled the size of the collection while I was there, but it's still not enough to do the kinds of things you do at the bigger museums. But I was intrigued by the idea of a period room and experimented with the ceramics and sort of an early attic late garage decor that mixed IKEA furniture with design within reach and Heath ceramics to try to have people start thinking about the fact that craft lived in the home, and it is really after the 1950s and 60s that a lot of craft media shifted into sculptural work. But what if we understood the kind of period rooms that are happening now through the lens of the collection was one of the ways I was playing around with the period room. We also did exhibitions that brought out history of important exhibitions, ceramic annuals that took place between 1950 and 1964. Again, the first exhibitions to document this history. People like Edgar J. Kaufman came out and juried these exhibitions from MoMA. It was from here that he discovered a number of artists that ended up in the Good Design Show. Peter Volkus was very involved in these annuals as a student and then as a juror later. These were the exhibitions that people waited for every year and then every other year to be able to see the most cutting-edge ceramic work that was going on the West Coast. We also used our archive as an experimental form, and the thing that is so exciting for me about these exhibitions that focus on the collection was allowing artists to come to me and say, I think I want to try this. I know it's crazy. And to be able to say, okay, you're right, that's a little crazy. Let's think it through and figure out how we can do it. So Kate and Clifton came to me and said, we want people to get the experience of flipping through the museum's archives and files. They never get to do that. How can we put them out in public? Now, I don't think you can do this in most museums because you're not going to be able to keep things safe. There's too many people coming and going in the museums. This is the advantage of a small museum. We put all of our archives into these envelopes. They are archival envelopes. So in putting them on public view, people could flip through them and look and see Peter Volkas's dry cleaning receipt, and they could see letters and sketches from the Knotzlers about the exhibition that they were putting on, so they could have this experience of flipping through the archive, and in exchange, all of our documents are now protected in these sleeves. So it was a win-win, but it was a design problem that we had to figure out, and it's a great way to bring out another way for people to understand craft history. It's not just the objects, it's all of the machinations that go into putting on an exhibition and running an organization and an institution as well. I also like to throw down the gauntlet every now and then, and this is an exhibition that we did where we brought out Eric Gromberg's work and said, hey, nobody's done a retrospective for this particular artist, and then now Garth Johnson picked up the gauntlet and did an exhibition with Eric's work and juxtaposed it against Aaron Toole's work. So it's about conversations. Again, it's about community. Understanding that the craft world is not just about making, it's also about all of this system, and it's not just about the commercial marketplaces either. It's about a lot of other things that are going on as well. So Touching Warms the Art is an exhibition that was dealing with the question of interactivity and touch in the museum. And I've written a lot about this exhibition, and you can find it online. So I'm just going to let you know that this was a way for us to use the museum to offer an interactive experience where people could try on and wear and handle jewelry, with artists gifting the work with the understanding that the jewelry may be broken, it may be stolen, it may disappear, we didn't know what would happen to it, but they would make it available for people to handle and engage. In the end, we ended up with almost 1,700 images of people wearing the jewelry that artists can look at, you can look at, anyone can look at. It takes the sort of what IDEO and eLab, a firm I used to work for, you talk about as guerrilla marketing, and where you just go around and you're doing a project on backpacks, so you take every picture of backpacks that you see as you're walking down the street. Those images then become the tools for understanding engagement with backpacks. These become the tools for understanding whether your jewelry is communicating what you thought it was going to communicate. And the artists, there were several artists who realized that their jewelry was not. So it gave them a chance to rethink their own work, which they never get to see people wearing their work. So it was a fabulous opportunity. In addition to that archive, all of the pieces are part of the living collection at Museum of Contemporary Craft, because my partner on this project, Rebecca Shear, said this project came out as a response to an exhibition that had happened at Tacoma Art Museum. And Rebecca was really insistent, and I think rightly so, that the pieces could not go back into storage after. If they've been touched and handled, they need to continue to be livable and engaged objects, right? So all of those pieces are part of the living collection. You can come to the museum and take them out, try them on, engage them, etc. We also had an art bar, and this is the other thing about craft. Craft is messy, and it's okay. It's really okay to have mess in the museum. This happened because visitors were making things at the art bar, and they started sticking them up on the wall. They didn't stick it on any artwork. They didn't stick it any place it shouldn't have gone. They stuck it on the wall and created their own response. We like being a museum where it's okay to make messes and have that happen. And I think that that is something that craft can do, is to break down that barrier. Museums are so tight, they need to be so clean. sometimes it's okay to be a mess, and we need to figure out ways to bring that into museums. Call and response was a way of bringing new people into the conversation, and Call and Response is an exhibition where I partnered and academics from the I-5 corridor near Portland. I partnered an artist who came from a craft-based practice with an art historian who did not come from an craft-based practice, and they were partnered across institutions and had to have a conversation and produce writing based on the artist's work. And it ended up producing a really fabulous set of essays which you can access online. But I also feel that the thing that a museum does, and one of the things that I work very hard at over the last 10 years, is to open the platform for young voices and new voices. When I started at the museum in 2004, Glenn Adamson, Alyssa Author, Ezra Shales, they hadn't published their books yet. And all of them became people who wrote for us, and we engaged them through writing in a number of different ways. A lot of those essays are available you can download them off of the internet. So it was a way of having this new emerging discourse become part of the conversation in a very direct way, and really nice matchmaking between the projects and the thinking that was going on in the field. Object Focus, the book, was the first in a series focused on the object, and I will tell you that artist-made books, when you want people to understand objects, are terrible to exhibit because they're under glass. You can't let people touch them. And this exhibition, honestly, was probably one of the exhibitions I feel really failed ultimately. Because if you don't know these objects and you've never handled them, you're not going to know what they are from standing there and staring into a case. And even though we created a table with objects for people, different books for people to handle, it wasn't enough. So we moved to focus on Object Focus, the bowl, for the next one. And I don't usually like this kind of, we're taking over kind of language, but we really did want to claim the bowl in the name of craft, because the bowl is not claimed by art, it's not claimed by design. So craft will take the bowl. Thank you very much. So I used a heuristic that Rick Robinson had developed and John Kane at eLab, a place I worked as a design ethnographer, researcher for this firm. And we broke down the way users engage the world into an AEIOU model, which you see here: activities, environments, interactions, objects, and users. So for the bowl exhibition, we started by thinking about bowls. What activities happen around bowls, with bowls, through bowls, with bowls between people? What kind of environments do we want bowls to be in? Where do we want them to circulate? Where are we going to exhibit them? And what kind of interactions could we prompt or know are going to happen with bowls through this exhibition? Thinking about the kinds of objects themselves, then thinking also about the users and trying to figure out then ultimately what kind of mapping of engagement could an exhibition do by bringing in all of these different AEIOU components into the exhibition itself, and have it all feed into a Tumblr, which is free, as a way of documenting the whole exhibition. So moving away from the book, when you're a small museum and you don't have the budget for a book, how do you use technology to be craft-oriented but make documentation happen? So all of these different areas are the ones that we addressed. And it started out with providing a list of bowls to a number of different writers from different disciplines. They could choose to write about a bowl from this list, my bowl, meaning one of their own bowls, or the bowl, as in the idea of the bowl. This was the exhibition that opened first upstairs. All of these are bowls from Portland collections. Every bowl was displayed at the same height. There wasn't anything lifted up from anything else. So it created kind of a level playing field for everything. So Lucy Rhee was actually positioned next to this beautiful paper, Japanese paper bowl, because the shape was exactly the same. Not everybody understood that, and I can tell you that there were visitors who came and said, "What are you doing? Lucy Rhee, that's Lucy Rhee." I said, "Yes, but it's a bowl. How is it a bowl? What would you use that bowl for? How would you engage that bowl?" So it gave different conversations, but it was all about trying to get you to talk about the thing itself. because it's the thing itself that is so hard to address with a bowl. So downstairs then, so this gives you a sense of what the tumbler looks like. Some of you may have seen this tumbler, but that's the URL up there for you if you want to take a look at the tumbler itself. And then we also included paintings and as well as bowls themselves. And then downstairs were a number of different projects, including 2 different ways of circulating objects. Michael Strand did bowls around town. Those bowls were circulated through the Noma Public Library, and Ayumi Horie did circulate within the museum, and those objects were circulated through the museum itself. The idea being then that people took the bowls home and wrote about the bowls, took pictures, shared their stories with us. Those stories went online next to Stephen Scove Holt's essay, Rob Walker's essay, Ezra Shales' essay. So the people in the field who we look to as leaders, as thought leaders, were next to drawings from students that they shared online, a poem that somebody shared about a bowl. It was a great way to create multiple voices on a simple platform, but without taking away from what each person contributes. This is something that I think a lot about through the physicist David Bohm. He wrote a book called On Dialogue. And it's very much about 2 people coming, for example, 2 people coming together who are diametrically opposed, but being in a position where they can speak to one another, understand one another, and attempt to create something else that doesn't require compromise necessarily of where their positions are. And that was what we were trying to do with this particular project, is to equalize, not even equalize isn't even the right word, but to create a platform where everybody could have a voice and it wasn't hierarchizing. Here are some pictures of some of the other parts of the installation and some of the submissions. Some of the documentation of one of the bowls as it was going through the Multnomah County Library. The bowls at the library were put online, and within 10 days they had booked it all the way through the end of the exhibition. So they asked us if they could get another bowl, and they ended up keeping those bowls, 3 bowls in circulation for over a year, so long past the end of the exhibition itself. They also were circulated to fire departments because Michael was interested in atypical family eating relationships, and the firemen didn't want to give the bowl back. So we, Sarah Margolis-Pinio, who was our associate curator at the time, went over with a plate of cookies and basically did a bait and snatch on getting our bowl back. We also wanted to talk about the bowl as a tool. So we worked with some of the most popular chefs and restaurateurs. And we also worked with a pizza place, one of the popular organic, of course, because it's Portland, pizza places, to serve bowls, serve their salads during the summer in bowls. There were a number of videos, and then the transference piece, which is basically glass harmonica. So it's about the bowl as something that emanates sound rather than receives something. So it really allowed for a flip to happen there in terms of what the bowl does. Gestures of Resistance was one of the most challenging and rewarding and exciting projects that we did. And this was curated by Judith Lehman and Shannon Stratton. It was a 6-month-long exhibition. It began with an empty gallery. And the first thing that happened is John Price and Sarah Black built this set. And I'll let you go online to learn all the details about it. But essentially, it started out with them responding to the artists that were coming in residencies, but building this set to start everything off. These are some of the artists who came through, and each of them did a different project that added and accumulated in the exhibition space. And then Erin Toole came in, and it was a great moment to rethink the performing craftsperson, right? That's something we see a lot. The theater of spectacle, of performance, is watching the potter at work. But what Erin does is tell stories about his war experiences. So it becomes this completely personal interaction in a very different way, and he gifts the cups at the end to anyone who wants them. And the Astrogates came and gave the whole exhibition a good whitewashing, which meant pouring slip over everything, including a bucket against the wall. And it was a great moment as a curator who had one other staff person in thinking about the really sexy, glamorous side of working in a small museum, because we had to clean it up. So, mess is great, but you have to know what you're getting into, and you have to be prepared, and you have to have the ability to clean it up afterwards. But I completely support letting artists do as much as they possibly can. It just takes conversations, but it's a lot messier to clean up this kind of a mess than it is to move a nozzle roll from a pedestal to pedestal. So really briefly, a couple of my current projects I'm working on across the table, across the land with Michael Strand. This is basically, I would say it's a different version of a crowdsourced exhibition. We created a web app and invited people to submit projects that would connect ceramics and food and community. They are all on a web app, you can access them, and then an exhibition is going to take place for the 50th anniversary of NCECA. And I'm working on an exhibition called Everything Has Been Material for Scissors to Shape. It's a line from a Pablo Neruda ode at the Wing-Luke Museum of Asian American Experience. This museum has the most amazing collection downstairs, and really powerful objects like a lot of this furniture and trunks and things that were from families that were incarcerated in the internment camps during World War II. What I did is I was asked to do two things: connect to the collection and to bring in artists to work through textiles. So I went through my research in the collection with an eye towards places that there were gaps or things that I could amplify in some way. And the only textile in their collection that is from South Asia is a pair of khadi undergarments that a Sikh man would wear. That's kind of shocking because, Indians, we do textiles. So it gave just a prime opportunity to work with Surabhi Ghosh, who works with khadi cloth. She's of Gujarati origin, and she works through khadi, and she's doing a piece. This is not the piece that's going in, but it's very representative of her work, and she's doing a piece that brings together Indian mythology and khadi cloth and the nationalist agenda that led to khadi cloth becoming so important in India with Gandhi and Gandhiji and everything. I also found a number of baskets, and some of these baskets entered into the museum because they said made in China or made in Korea. Not all of them. Some of the baskets, they have the provenance on, but some of the baskets were just brought in for other reasons. And it started me wondering, when you are in a situation where commodity culture and these kinds of trade objects, or and I say trade, but these inexpensive objects are the stand-in for your culture at places like Pier 1 and so forth. How do you manage that? What does that say about American identity, about your identity, about the history of these objects as signifiers for whole groups of people and histories? And of course, the person who came to mind to address this is Stephanie Sujuko, who has done this cargo cult piece, where she goes to Pier 1 and purchases objects, adorns herself in a tribal image, and photographs herself in these garments and things that she's adorned herself with. I also found this great exhibition in the archives called "If Tired Hands Could Talk." So Chinatown is the area where Eddie Bauer and all the factories that are no longer in Seattle except for Filson used to be located. So a lot of the residents from Chinatown, the women who lived in that area, were the labor workers, the garment workers who worked in the factories. And there are these incredible oral histories in the museum's archive about working in those factories. These are histories that could never be done again. It's so important that we document through oral histories, and I know that that's a really important project Catherine and her students have been working on. If that had not been done, there would be zero record of the narratives that these women offer for what their lives were like working in those factory environments. And I partnered that with Aram Cifuentes' piece, Amend, where she takes the ends off of jeans that seamstresses and tailors are hemming for people in Chicago, and she makes a quilt out of them. And then the last thing in the exhibition is to bring out the collection pieces and to bring together Green Eileen, which has a wonderful reuse and recycling program. They will be providing textiles for this project, and the museum has programmed an incredible number of Cambodian and Hmong textile artists from the community to teach. Because one of the things that's really challenging for me is that when I go to fiber programs around the country through the many really outstanding fiber guilds that do great work, you are often being taught techniques by people of European origin who have studied it and not by the community itself. And I don't think it's an either or, and I don't want to be misinterpreted or misunderstood. I think you need to have everything, but you also need to find folks in the community who can offer that opportunity to exchange their knowledge in a public setting as well. And Design Your Everyday at the Frost Museum. I'm interested in this because of the growth of maker spaces that are happening in science museums. It's a huge thing right now, and in libraries. And as much as I love museums, I kind of love libraries, maybe even a little more, because my first job was in a library. And I'm very intrigued in the circulatory aspects of libraries with maker spaces, and this project is a way to think that through. In the future, the collecting issue is going to be the one that all of you who are students are going to have to think about, because there is a tsunami, as our colleague Elizabeth Agro puts it, a tsunami of objects from the studio craft movement that are about to hit the market in the next decade. Somebody's going to need to figure out how to document this work, how to catalog it, how to sort through it, figure out what needs to be in museums, where they need to go. This is going to be the task that you are going to be left with going forward. And with that, I will say thank you for your time. Time for some questions?
Absolutely.
Super. Could we maybe have the lights up?
There we go. I should say that we changed the format from our usual U-shaped table because we had so many people coming. But as you can see, Namita is very willing to engage in conversation, so please feel free to ask her questions you want.
Hi. Thank you for a great talk. It was fascinating. I wanted to actually kind of readdress the question that you raised about diversity, and especially, certainly you talked about it a little bit in terms of curatorial staff and people who are interested in curating craft. I wanted to know if you obviously are working on an exhibition about Asian American designers or even Asian designers, but I wanted to know if kind of what your read on reading the communities, what diversity in craft disciplines across the U.S. really looks like, and whether you're seeing a change or a sea change in terms of collecting priorities of institutions, but also in terms of maybe the increasing prominence of craftsmen and people who are making these objects across disciplines.
Great question. I think there are a couple of things going on. One thing that's very interesting right now is that there are a large number of students from Korea and China who are coming to the United States to study art. And at one point in time, a lot of the students coming over had already received a master's degree prior to coming. Now it seems to be a little bit more of a mixture of first-time graduate students as well as second degree graduate students. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how many of the folks in that community and in that group of people stay in the States, and what impact it has on changing teaching, changing objects that are made, changing the scene, and how many will be going back to Korea or to China and shifting things over in other places as well. That's one thing that is happening. Second thing that's interesting is with Across the Table, Michael and I did a K-12 challenge thanks to 3 teachers who worked with us to develop this opportunity for K-12 teachers to really engage across the table as a project. What is fascinating is in the photographs that we got back from ceramics programs, I'd say there's a couple dozen that sent in images of their students working. Tremendous diversity, tremendous diversity. The university level work, very little diversity. So it gave us a sort of a place to look to see where we're losing kids, where we're losing the diversity to move everyone further and into professional degrees. So in terms of it changing or shifting, the students yesterday asked me this question and I was a little cynical. In 1992, I received a fellowship to go to the Smithsonian for museum leadership. And at that time, it was to celebrate diversity and really work to change the landscape of museum professionals. By the end of the year after that fellowship, there were maybe 5 or 6 of 15 who were still working in the field. So the attrition rate is pretty horrendous. There are systems that need to be changed. I said this yesterday too. It needs to be something where we redo the core curriculum. We need to change that. It can't be that studying an Asian-focused subject is an elective. It needs to be incorporated. Instead of saying, I work really hard at teaching a class on theory of objects, and it's really hard to always try to remember to say Western philosophy, European-based philosophy, rather than to just say philosophy, because philosophy doesn't incorporate Asian philosophy. So it's things like that to sort of help try to rethink things. They're hard. I don't always remember to say that, and I don't always remember to think, to get it out there. But I think that there are just some fundamental things that have to shift. I'd like to see it change because right now I can tell you that I'm the first South Asian American woman to be the director of a craft museum in the United States. And I may be the first South Asian woman to direct a collecting contemporary art museum in the United States. And it's 2016. That's not really good. We've been here since 65. We were here before that, but we were here definitely since 65. There should be more people. Just in, from my background. There's a question over here.
Yeah, this is, well, first of all, thank you so much. It was so exciting, and I understand the whirlwind gale force. You're curating, you gave us some very exciting projects, and I was wondering, when you imagine a show, this is a curator question, and you think about audience, doers, lookers, collector consumers, how do they balance out in your imaginary audience?
Doers, lookers,
And collector consumers.
and collector consumers. Boy, that's a great question. The environment lends itself, it is a looking environment, right? So the first thing it has to do is to be appealing visually. It has to have a choreography, it has to have thought-through scenography, it has to be a space people want to be in order to engage in that act of looking and to look for a long time. In terms of doing, I think it's really important that whatever active engagement happens has to be connected to the exhibition in some way. One of the things we did, for example, with Lori Herrick is we made these cardboard looms that we left in a couple of spots on tables in the exhibition, and visitors could come and weave just a little bit and experiment, and it was a very simple solution, but it tied in directly with the exhibition itself. In terms of collectors, things don't happen without collectors. So collectors are incredibly important, but artists are collectors too. And so I think it's really important to remember that your sources for the objects don't always have to come from specific places. They can come from lots of different sources as well. And I think in terms of collectors, and what was the collectors was connected with?
Collector consumer.
Consumers. The museum has a gallery store. That's a place to consume. If you are you know, to think about some of these objects as commodities. And again, there too, the gallery store at Museum of Contemporary Craft tends to really focus on small production runs, handmade things, things that represent the values of the kind of work that's being shown in the exhibitions as well. Does that address?
Oh, very much so, thank you.
Cool.
Can you elaborate or just comment a little bit more on your point about factories and what are some of the personal implications or historical echoes? Or I mean, that's really fascinating. Where do you see that going?
No, it's interesting. And Ezra Shales has done some work in this area, written about it and been talking about it. And I think probably at least like 5 years or so he's been talking about this. I can't remember how long. And that's sort of where I first started thinking about it, honestly, in a different way and looking for it. What I'm seeing is an interest in the factory. There seems to be a bit of a romanticization. I mean, factories are going away. People, it's as much as a loom is an interesting object, a factory is an interesting system because people don't see it. They don't get to engage it. It's not a part of people's lives anymore. So we've got generations that did not grow up with their parents working in factory environments. And it becomes an interesting idea where the machines are tools in a way that, you know, a wheel is a tool to a potter. And I think what I'm seeing are a number of young people who are interested in purchasing factories, small factories, keeping up traditions of certain kinds of blankets, certain kinds of, sorry, you don't need to see my whole laptop. Certain kinds of things along that line. I'm also seeing interesting work. I juried the GIC Korean Biennale last year, and there were 2 artists specifically who were working with the factory as the subject matter, and Neil Brownswood actually was the person who all of us gave the top prize to, and he did a project where he went into the old Spode factory and brought in China painters who were the sort of pinnacle of workers because of their hand skills. And they used old Spode plates and did China paintings of the factory in its state of ruins. And instead of Neil coming out to Korea, he sent one of the painters out to paint and do a performance. And so that's just one example of where I'm starting to see it in different places. I also see it with my students. They're very interested in working with factories and small limited production runs and things like that for garments and blankets and things like that. Or one of my former interns is a designer now at Pendleton. So there's a sense that somehow it's still connected to hand working, but on a different scale. It's about scalability and increased production possibilities instead. Josh Kopis is another artist who works in North Carolina who's interested in the brick factory, and he just can wax eloquently about the beauty of watching bricks made in the factory. And so there isn't that same sort of negative relationship with factories that I think we've had in the past.
I have a question that I thought was going to be totally gratuitous for the benefit of my students, some of whom are here, and I'll say teach on ethnography and material worlds. But actually, your answer to this last question provided a great segue. And that's, can you reflect a little bit about how your experience working as an ethnographer has influenced your approach to curating, especially the kinds of materials you curate? Because the question entered my mind when you were talking about the bowl to show specifically. But your answer to the last question sort of fueled my interest in it.
It completely ties in. I worked for 2 years as a research assistant in graduate school with Arjuna Padare, and who wrote The Social Life of Things. And so that was where I was able to really think very much. And he was working on globalization and other questions, but it opened up access to thinking about art in a different sort of way. And I also worked with his wife, Carol Breckenridge, who edited Public Culture at the time. And so in working with them, that really was my first moment to think about anthropology and the relationship there. My dissertation, which I did not finish, was looking at the aesthetics of everyday life through the immigrant perspective. I was interested in how South Asians inhabit cookie-cutter suburban architecture because storage spaces and basement spaces and walls are dealt with very, very differently. So in some ways, maybe it's coming a bit out of being the first generation that had me sort of look at these spaces and these questions a little bit differently. But I would say in terms of the active use of thinking about users and thinking about ethnography, that really came from the year and a half I worked at eLab, where Rick Robinson also went to University of Chicago, and it was the most fantastic environment because you're sitting there and you're studying convenience stores, and then you go, oh, this is the panopticon, it's Foucault's panopticon, and everyone knows what you're talking about, and together you can actually make a design recommendation to fix convenience stores. So honestly, it was that hands-on work of watching side-by-side refrigerators and how people engage them and thinking about it that made me think a lot more about how we engage our objects and the kinds of questions we ask of people when we engage them.
Namita, I have a few questions coming in
Sure.
on Twitter. So I think
Cool.
we could take one of those and maybe one more question from the audience.
Okay, shall I take a second to scan these?
I think it's just the top one.
Just the top one?
Yeah.
Sarah Margolis Pinio asks, and I should say she was my assistant curator for 2 years. She says, criticism is crucial to the arthropology. How can writers expand craft discourse, break down silos, and make new connections? I
In
think
140 characters.
in 140 characters. See, this is why I hired her. I think that the challenge with writing is that we are trained through art history. We are trained through modernism, we're trained through postmodernism, whatever ism you want to put in there, but we're trained through art history. And it's different. It's a different way of looking at the world. And I think we have to figure out, are we substituting craft for art in some of our theoretical writing, or are we actually pushing discourse into a new place? And in terms of criticism, I've never been a big fan of the critic who rakes things over a coal, says, yes, that's great, no, that's not. I want to hear better questions asked of work, and I want to hear people in their writing really trying to understand and push things, push people's understanding in a different direction would be much more interesting to me. I also think that we need to move away from books and the printed form as being the primary way we understand knowledge to be documented, disseminated, record keeping. There are lots of other things now. There are podcasts, there are audio recordings. All of us walk around with these phones that have recordings. You could take an oral history on the spot like that and document something that would never be documented any other time. You can take photographs all the time. You can upload it like that onto Instagram and Flickr and you name it. We have all these tools now to change how we do research, but also how we move away from writing itself back to some of these other ways of exchanging knowledge.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, and you were discussing how there was a separation of how craft was trying to be up to par with like the bigger art museums, and there's this juxtaposition of that going on. But when you're talking about craft, I also was thinking about how there's a separation of like folk art and how that's considered. And I've been studying a lot of American folk art, like Pennsylvania Dutch, and that I would consider that craft, but that the way it's viewed in a museum setting or at auction houses, or when people look at it, they study it in a completely different context. There's writings, there's people that are able to study and say that there's this art form that's going on that's fine, but they're calling it folk. Do you see there's a differentiation, or do you just think that's something that academia has created in its own mind, or is it the same thing?
That's a great question, and I think it's one of the ones that I grapple with also, because I feel like I haven't had a chance to really break that boundary down myself in my own work, and I'd like to figure out how. Some of that started with the bowl show. I was able to bring in like little chai dishes, chai cup that melts when you drink the chai out of it and things like that. I deliberately wore this garment today because I just bought it, and it's from the 1920s from India, and you can't find these vintage garments anymore, and there is just such an incredible strength and power in this kind of embroidery, and to look at the back is spectacular. The workmanship is just, it's incredible. But I purchased it partly because I wanted to remind myself that that is a place that I think needs to be addressed more. And that's part of what I'm doing with the textile exhibition at the Wing Luke, is bringing out some of the folk embroideries and connecting those with contemporary practice. So it does come up against each other. In terms of silos and categories, I mean, human beings categorize things. It's how we make order, how we make sense of things. I think what's incredible is when you find a place where you can clearly, or in some way that in a project where it makes sense to break down those boundaries, is always an interesting thing to do in my mind. But they don't always succeed. I mean, but to try it is a great thing to do. And I would just encourage you to keep working on that area and seeing if there is a way that you can be part of thinking through another way. It's not going to change. You're asking for systemic change, and I mean, if diversity is an issue, that's not going to change very quickly either. But you can find ways in your own work and your own research to bring things out and put them against each other and read them against each other in different ways to create a new understanding of that connection there, for sure.
Thank you.
Namita, thanks so much. Do you want to ask one last question?
I was going to ask a different question, but I should just mention, because there's something related to the answer that you just gave to this young woman, and that's that in the early years of what we now call the Museum of Arts and Design under Paul Smith's direction, and I've seen him over there because I've looked at every single one of his catalogs from the time that he was the director. Almost every one includes large amounts of what we might think of as, folk or ethnographic objects with contemporary craft. They're really fascinating, and I've never seen another craft museum do that. He's the only person I know who pulled that off, and it's really very interesting. So it's been done, and I'll talk to you at some other point, because we haven't had a chance to discuss this. We're going to work together on this exhibition of the catalogs, but I just want to know what people's reaction was to those shows back in the day.
I'll just say that those are digitized on the American Craft Council Library's website, and you can see them. And you can read Paul's oral history in our oral history project, where he talks about them. Great.
Well, and what decade? This is the 60s, right?
Late 50s, 1960s, 1970s. Yeah, they're really fascinating exhibitions. And I was shocked at his ability to bring these different, what we would think of as markets together, because they really are just market-defined categories.
But see, and I wonder if a lot of that, because Mrs. Webb was connected with the World Craft Council, and Arlene Fish and Ken Shores and Paul and a number of people went to, was it Peru that you went to?
Well, the World Craft Council had meetings in various parts of the world, yes.
Yeah,
Peru,
like
Mexico.
68-ish, right?
And
Or 64, rather, sorry.
64 it began in New York.
So there was this travel that was happening then. And you know, it's an interesting question, and Lisa, I'm curious to see what will happen, because the other question that I get from people is a fear of misrepresenting another culture, a fear of being perceived as co-opting another culture. And there seems to be this backlash against bringing in your responses, like you know, go to South Africa, you're interested in the beating, so you do something in response. Is that going to be perceived in a negative way? And we need to have more nuanced understanding of what appropriation is. Coachella is appropriation. You know, what happens there. And it can't just be like that or nothing, because what ends up happening is I think students then aren't looking to the rest of the world in the same way, and it's a problem.
It is a risk in today's critical context, that's for
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really productive part of the conversation that will come out of what you're working on. That's great.
Well, again, thank you so much,
Thank
Namita.
you.